You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Hello and welcome back to Retail Disrupted. Now, you might have noticed that today's episode looks a little bit different. Today, we are going to be trialing the first ever video version of the podcast. And let me start out by firstly saying this is totally an experiment. I keep hearing that people like to watch podcasts. Now, I am not one of those people. I love podcasts, but for me, the beauty of a podcast is being able to put your earphones in and listen to it as you get other stuff done. But apparently, there are a lot of you out there that like to watch video. So we're going to trial it today. As always, I look to you, the listeners of this podcast. I look to you all for feedback to let me know what's working, to let me know if this is the kind of thing you want to see more of or less of. Are there any specific guests you'd like to hear from or any topics you'd like us to delve into? All of this is really, really helpful to shape the podcast and make sure that the content I'm pushing out is relevant and interesting for you. So please do get in touch. You can drop me an email or, send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter, and that would be hugely appreciated. Now, for today's show, I am delighted to welcome Helen Dickinson, the Chief Executive of the BRC, the British Retail Consortium. Helen has kindly agreed to join me today as part of this little experiment. And Helen's name has actually come up a few times on this podcast, so it's great to have her here with me today. The BRC has just launched its manifesto, and Helen is going to talk us through her vision for the future of retail. And she's also going to talk about the specific changes that the BRC is calling for to get us there. I know a lot of you know Helen, but let me say a few words about her. Now, Helen has been working with retailers for over 25 years. She has been leading the BRC team and setting the strategic direction there for over a decade. In 2016, she was awarded an OBE for services to retail. Helen is passionate about diversity and inclusion, and I know the BRC is doing some really fantastic work in this space, so I would encourage you all to check out the BRC site after this and see the work that they're doing, because it's really important work. Helen also acts as the BRC's Social Mobility Commission Ambassador. She participates in the TimeWise Innovation Unit, looking to support more flexibility in jobs, particularly at senior levels. She also supports the Every Woman Retail Ambassadors Program, and she was previously the chair of Working Chance, which is a charity that helps female offenders to find employment. It's such a privilege to have Helen here with me today, and I hope you get a ton of value from this conversation. Let's dive in. Now, today, Helen, we are going to be talking about the BRC manifesto, which has just launched. There is a lot to unpack, but let's start from the top. So in the document, you refer to retail being the everywhere economy, and you call out how it's a vital part of the socioeconomic fabric of the UK. It touches all of us. We're all connected to this industry in some shape or form. But as we know, it's an industry that's had its fair share of disruption in recent years, from tech disruption to the pandemic to economic and geopolitical disruption. So before we get into the specific changes that you're calling for, I'd love to get your views on the current state of retail and some of the hurdles that retail businesses are facing today.
Well, certainly it's been a challenging few years for a lot of people, and I think that really came to the fore during the course of the pandemic, where the recognition and the realization of the importance of the industry in ensuring that we all stayed fed, that we continue to have access to the goods that we wanted and needed through a hopefully, she says, fingers crossed, the most significant thing that happened in our lifetime, and won't ever be repeated. But what that really showed was the resilience and the agility that the industry is capable of, and perhaps has been a little bit hidden before those moments. And what we've seen since then is that significance of disruption has continued because we had the supply chain problems, then we've moved into high inflationary environment from a cost point of view. We've now got challenges in the Red Sea following the war in Ukraine last year. So the ability of retail businesses, whatever shape or size or category of product that they're selling, to be able to navigate the issues of the moment, as well as some of the more structural things that I'm sure we'll come onto in this conversation, has been really quite a testament, I guess, to all the great people who work in the industry. And throughout last year, throughout 2023, retail sales grew, but not by a huge amount. A lot of that was price rises rather than volume increases. So profits are under a lot of pressure for many businesses, and that input cost inflation has eased quite a bit, but is still there as part of our backdrop as we move into 2024. From a consumer point of view, consumers are still trying to balance their own budgets. So consumer confidence isn't that great. It's better than it was, but it's still negative if you look at the GfK indicator. So we're moving it. We still have a backdrop of disruption. The customer environment isn't necessarily going to be super helpful. As is always the case in retail, there will be winners and losers, but there is a lot of structural questions and issues which are really relevant as we move into the possibility of an election, hence the manifesto.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think we're certainly not out of the woods yet. We seem to be moving in the right direction. But you called out inflation and cost pressures. And I know a lot of retailers are citing wage inflation and business rate rises as concerns for this year. And I know we're going to talk about business rates in more detail in a little bit. But before we do that, Helen, I have your manifesto printed out in front of me because I am still very much a pen and paper girl. And I want to jump into looking at the future, because you've got a nice visual here with your vision for the future of retail. And you've got a one-line summary, which I'm just going to read out for our listeners, which is that your sort of aspirations for retail is for it to become a net zero, digitally transformed, thriving industry, enabling us to shop where and how we want, and providing highly skilled jobs across the country. Now, that sounds great. That touches on a lot of themes, which I'm sure we'll get into. But perhaps you can just start out with a little bit of an overview of the retail industry that you would like to see in the future.
Well, it builds on that summary that you've just highlighted. I think the challenge that we have, and that sort of comes back to why we called the manifesto, accelerating this everywhere economy, because my belief, and certainly I think is a fairly widely held view, is that there is more potential for the industry, more that the industry could do because of its scale, because it is everywhere, because it touches the lives of everybody. I mean, it's the largest private sector employer. That's 3 million people, another 2.7 million people down the supply chains of retail just in this country. And so if any future government of whatever colour it may be creates the right environment, the right policy and regulatory framework, the right tax environment that will enable our great, highly respected, resilient, agile, all the things that we were saying before, industry to be able to do more, to go faster, to accelerate towards that vision of a future that I think is one that we would all aspire to, certainly those that work in retail. So more productive, higher paid jobs, getting to net zero faster than the government's aspirations of 2050, to be able to ensure that there is ongoing and quality investment in local communities. So these are, the circular economy. I mean, all of these things are things that many businesses are really trying to do, and in lots of instances are being held back from some of the potential that is there. And that's really what the manifesto is trying to lay out. It's trying to say there is a great future here, an industry that can be even greater than the one that we have at the moment. And these are just some of the things that will help accelerate us towards that great future.
Right. And Helen, let's talk about business rates in more detail, because I know this is something that you're really passionate about. And for me, as an outsider, it just feels like a totally antiquated system. And it also doesn't really feel reflective of the way that we shop today, right? Because around more than 25% of retail sales take place online. And as shoppers, we just want a blend of physical and digital experiences. We don't think in channels. It's the retailers that think in channels, but as shoppers, we just, want that seamless experience. And it just seems to me, it seems unfair to have a tax system that is advantageous for online retailers while penalizing bricks and mortar stores. And I found it really interesting in the manifesto how you talked about the impact on store closures, with 6,000 storefronts having closed in the past 5 years. And what I thought was even more profound was that 2/3 of retailers have cited, the 2/3 of retailers that have shut stores have cited business rates as having had a material impact on the decision-making process. So, this is a perennial problem. It doesn't seem like there's an easy solution, but what does a reform of business rates look like?
Well, what a reform of business rates looks like is a burden that is way less significant than the burden that we have at the moment, because it is holding back that investment. And as you say, from a consumer point of view, if people don't think about channels. The big challenge has always been that from a government point of view, they don't think about industries, right? They think the tax system is based on taxing people, taxing property, taxing profits. And part of the big issue with the business rate system is that this is a tax that applies before any profits are made, and the UK is completely out of line with pretty much any other developed country in terms of the proportion of all the business taxes that are raised through property. So if you think of the business tax base of the Treasury, we think they've got their sums wrong in terms of how much they're allocating to property. And because a lot of retailers have a lot of property, that burden is falling disproportionately on retail when it should be spread much more widely across the rest of the economy. So we're saying, think about what that tax system looks like, bring the burden down on the physical bit of property, and what you will get in return is more investment in local communities. More of those marginal physical spaces, those stores, will either remain open or be opened, because the business case will then become that much more viable than it was before. And that then in turn creates local jobs, creates vibrant high streets and communities up and down the country, and gives us all, as members of the public, places where we want to go and we want to spend time. And that applies as much to retail as it does to hospitality, to all the things that we want in our local communities. So making sure that we have the right economics to facilitate that investment is what we're saying. And I think a lot of conversations about business rates within the retail industry end up as a conversation about what's happening in retail, whereas actually the part of the reason that it's taken us so long to get to this point is that the challenge is not even just a retail one, it's a broader business taxation one, and where where does the tax burden, the business tax burden in its entirety fall? And at the moment, it's falling disproportionately on an industry that basically does not deserve it.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. And I just want to pick up on your point around jobs because AI was a hot topic last week at the World Economic Forum. And don't worry, Helen, I'm not going to ask you about AI. um,
Well,
relax,
I think
relax.
it's a great subject.
But the head of the IMF at the World Economic Forum last week said that AI could impact 40% of all jobs globally for better or for worse. So there's a lot of focus on the kind of negative aspect of this in the media, but I think, AI is just going to make us, it is going to make us a lot more productive. And it's also, I think, going to change the nature and the role of store staff in the future, which is probably a whole other topic. But the point is a lot of change is coming. And considering, as you said earlier, that retail is the largest private sector employer in this country, what do you think the industry needs to do to ensure that it continues to attract and retain talent?
Well, I think that, AI is part of that solution. What we have seen, even before some of the more significant impacts of AI start to kick in, is a real evolving nature of the world of retail jobs. Certainly, relative to the size of the industry, there are fewer people in retail than they were sort of 10, 20 years ago. And that is because retailers have become more efficient. They have invested in a lot of, particularly across the supply chain technology, logistics, warehousing. And what we have seen is, and it's a bit of a sort of, government policy conversation about productivity, but efficiency, which is my sort of layman's terms of productivity, layman's translation of what productivity means, has increased in retail faster than it has across the rest of the economy. Wages in retail have risen faster than they have across the rest of the economy. And what that says to me is that, we haven't, again, comes back to the sort of agility, the resilience, the ability of the industry to respond to the environment around it.
And also just how competitive it is as well. Do you think that's a
Well,
factor?
yeah, good point. Very good point. We should have mentioned that right at the beginning. I mean, it is that intensity of competitiveness does give us, again, we're wearing two hats, aren't we? We're sort of, considering what's happening in retail and being shoppers and consumers as well. And that competitiveness makes sure that we, with our shopper hat on, get the best value because they're always fighting for space. But I suppose coming back to your question, I think we are now seeing higher paid, more productive jobs than we saw in retail in the past. And what AI will do, I think, will accelerate that certainly in lots of different areas, and change not perhaps so much more the numbers, but more the nature and the tasks of the jobs that do currently sit in retail. And so what retailers have to do, coming very back to your question, is really think about how to evolve, retrain people, reskill people. And, if I wanted to be a bit challenging to the industry, staff turnover in lots of areas is quite high. So if we want to retain people, we need to, really tool them to be able to do different jobs rather than losing them to other industries. And so I think we need to do more to invest more in training, in reskilling, and technology is, but a brackets significant part of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's also probably worth calling out that it's a really hard time to work in retail, given some of the kind of broader challenges around shoplifting and abuse towards retail staff. And I know those are topics that you touched on in your manifesto. And actually on the podcast last month, I had another industry trade body on, the Association of Convenience Stores. I had Chris Noyce from the ACS on, and he was talking about the shoplifting epidemic. And I was just really stunned to learn the scale of the problem. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty well documented in the media, and so I was kind of aware of how much of a regular occurrence this has become. But I think what surprised me was just how underreported it is. And in your
Mm,
manifesto, you called out how one retailer said that police failed to turn up in nearly 3/4 of incidents that were
mm,
reported. That to me is
mm,
shocking. And, there's a huge
mm,
cost to all of this. There's obviously a human cost, but
mm,
there's also the
mm.
financial cost because it's costing retailers nearly £2 billion a year. So something has to change. But what do you think can be done, Helen, to deter retail theft and staff abuse? What are you looking for from the government?
Well, what we're looking for is two things really. We need part of the issue with reporting is that becomes a bit circular, right? The retailers don't think the police are going to respond, so they stop reporting. Part of the reason why the police don't respond is a resourcing question. So that's the one of the asks is really to invest more in the resourcing and the focus and the prioritization that sits within retail. But because it's not reported, the police say that they don't have visibility of the scale of the problem, and so because they don't know what the scale is, they're not investing the resource. So what we need is, as well as that increased resource, is a standalone offence for violence and abuse against retail workers, because having it as a standalone offence forces the system to measure and be able to assess the response rates as to what actually happens. So we are asking for those two things, and there's a lot of ongoing discussion with the current government about this issue, who is asking us, the BRC, to help collect some data. We are engaging with the Labour Party as well, because they've already committed to such a standalone offence, because they too know how important this issue is. And you know, it's interesting that you mentioned the Association of Convenience Stores, because historically, I mean, I've been at the BRC for 10 years, but in the pre-COVID days, a while ago, there were a lot of issues associated with age restricted, buying alcohol or cigarettes, or if someone wants to buy a knife, that's another age restricted sales. So this issue was very, convenience stores, supermarkets were quite in the front line. And what we've seen over the last few years is, they remain very, very firmly in that front line. But it's retailers of all shapes, all sizes, all sales categories that are feeling the effects of this now. So it is a much more significant societal and widespread problem than it was historically.
Yeah, that's interesting, and hopefully, things will start to improve. And yeah, so if we shift gears, Helen, let's talk about sustainability and your climate action roadmap. So
Mm,
we know the critical role that retail plays when it comes to decarbonization, and in your manifesto, you called out that 1/3 of every UK citizen's carbon footprint comes from the goods that they buy. So the sector obviously has a huge responsibility here, and also, as you say in the manifesto, an opportunity to really turbocharge the UK's transition to net zero. So, can you talk us through how you're working with retailers to achieve this, and what your policy recommendations are here?
So from a roadmap point of view, we did some work a few years ago to create the roadmap. I mean, it is literally a roadmap. It has a goal. It has milestones. It has interim milestones. It's divided into 5 pathways that look at what data that you need to be able to track progress, how you influence particularly your suppliers, what you need to do across logistics, what you need to do in your own operations, and then finally how you might influence your customers and your employees to make more sustainable choices. So the way the roadmap works is that we bring expertise either from within the BRC or some of the partners that we work with to help inform, advise, share experiences across the retailers on some of the aspects that sit within those pathways, and provide the forums and the guidance to really help people go faster than they would go on their own. So that is happening irrespective of who's in government and what government does. From a government point of view, there is a work area from the Environment Department called DEFRA, called the Waste and Resources Strategy. So it has a lot in it around recycling of packaging, of electrical equipment, of plastic bottles. So there's all sorts of new regulations and policies that are in the pipeline that are either very expensive, may or may not achieve the outcome that is sought. And so one of the areas in the manifesto is making sure that this waste and resources strategy really delivers the outcomes that are being set in a way that works, is practical, cost effective, and going to work both from retailers' point of view and their customers' point of view. So there is a whole policy area around that. And then there is also the other two sort of big areas that are going to be helpful from a policy point of view for retail as we move into certainly the next 5 years. So sources of renewable energy. So really getting that plan clear so that the business community can work out where they should be investing, and around net zero logistics. So there's lots of electrical light good vehicles around, but for heavy goods vehicles, the technologies aren't clear as to what is going to be the VHS versus Betamax route for HGVs, and that is holding back investment. And so if we can if government can set that path and ensure the policies are clear, then again, back to accelerating the investment of the everywhere economy, the industry can really make a difference on the transition to net zero, not just of the industry itself, but of consumers that the industry serves and of the country in terms of the country's ambition.
Yeah. And sustainability is one of those trends where it's just not going to go away, right? It's here with us, and retailers, have no choice but to, continue investing. And I think it's always challenging for consumers as well, because I think a lot of consumers want to do the right thing and make the right choice, but it's also about, they sort of expect the retailer to, to be doing the heavy lifting. And also they don't always want to sacrifice the convenience of things like fast and free delivery and everything.
Or the price.
So it's very nuanced, or the price.
Or
exactly.
The price.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but really interesting. Sorry, did you want to? No. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think, the industry has not just a desire, but also a responsibility. People can't, we as shoppers, we need help to make better choices. There is there are trade-offs that, it is not a straightforward decision about, which channel is a better channel, is some cotton really sustainable or not, and just a sustainable cotton that comes halfway around the world, is that better or worse than slightly less sustainable cotton that is sourced from a country that might be closer to the UK? So these things are pretty difficult to navigate, and require a lot of investment in clarity of what you're trying to do, as well as understanding some of these areas where a lot of the thought leadership and thought processes are still evolving. So again, it does make it quite challenging for the businesses, but everybody is up for the ambition. hence the roadmap. And the government really has a role to play to help us get there quicker.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I guess just one final point based on what you've just said is I think consumers with more transparency might make better, they make those better informed decisions, because you think
Yeah.
from a consumer perspective today, we have so much transparency when it comes to things like pricing, product availability, product reviews.
Yeah.
We have so much information at our fingertips, but when it comes to sustainability, it's kind of murky water. So yeah, really great to see the progress being made. But if we switch gears here, Helen, I just have a couple more questions for you because I know we've covered so much ground already. I'm going to ask you about something that's not in your manifesto, but I thought you would certainly have an opinion on, which is tax-free shopping for international visitors.
Mm.
Now, just a little recap for our listeners. This is something that was scrapped by the government as part of Brexit a few years ago, but there was a lot of noise in the industry to get it reinstated. Especially from those luxury brands. I think London-based luxury brands in particular are really, feeling the impact. They're sort of more disproportionately impacted than other sectors. And there was an article in the FT just last week saying that international visitor numbers have rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, but the average spend has dropped and has been on a downward trajectory, is a hard word to say, since for the first half of 2023. So that was the kind of those are the data points they were looking at. Now, looking outside the UK, international spending is looking pretty robust in other countries, in France and Italy and Spain. Helen, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think the Treasury underestimated the impact of ending tax-free shopping?
The answer to that question is fairly straightforward. Yes. And I think the actual ending of it was during COVID. So I thought, because not a lot of people were traveling, the impact was considered to be quite small. And I think what has become clear as more data and evidence is available is that actually the UK is losing out to other European markets now that international travel has really, really started to bounce back. And from a government point of view, there is a very strong, coalition that is being led by a gentleman called Paul Barnes, who is, I think
he was quoted in the
actual
FT article.
Umbrella is called the Association of International Retail, but he is, he's working with us, with the luxury industry, with lots of different players from right up and down the country. And while, yes, as you say, there is a real strong perspective from the luxury industry, particularly in London, what the evidence is really showing, particularly now, and particularly since we are outside the EU, if it were reinstated, this would apply to EU shoppers coming into the UK as well. So our opportunity is even bigger than it was in previously, because the UK would end up being the only country in the EU where EU shoppers could shop tax-free. So lots of evidence. A government who perhaps has recognised that it needs to be looked at again. And in fact, the Chancellor in the autumn statement did say, when he was standing up and delivering his autumn statement, that he would look at it again. Now, he didn't have to say that if he wasn't going to. So there is some cautious optimism that may in fact be the case, and he decides to change his mind and may or may not do that in the March budget. So it's a very live issue. We're encouraging people to ensure that if they are, in fact, they have to do it by the 24th of January. So if this only goes out on that day, you better get your pen out or your email out. But there is a portal to submit any things that people want in the March budget. So to feed into government. So we're encouraging everybody to really include that in any submissions that any individual companies might make, because I think the chance we have a window of opportunity with this government now, and it seems that they are changing their mind, that maybe they got their numbers wrong before.
One final question for you, Helen. If you had to pick just one thing that the next government could do that would benefit the retailers in this country, what would it be? What would you prioritize?
I would prioritize business rates, because it has just been such a perennial issue for the industry for so long. I would put that top, but I suppose my overarching point, because that sounds a bit negative. It sounds a bit like, oh, well, here we go about business rates again. But I mean, certainly it is the biggest point that comes up in the conversations I and across a lot of people within the BRC that we have. But my overarching sort of positive to end on would be much more about a different type of relationship with whatever new government, so that we really can accelerate this everywhere economy for all the reasons that we've just been talking about, because we have a great industry in this country, and the potential to really drive that, that digital transformation, that local investment, that net zero transition, that reskilling of people who work in the economy, such a significant proportion. That is a real opportunity for a new government because of the scale that the industry has. So I would, my biggest overarching ask is that we can work with them to take advantage of that.
Brilliant. Listen, Helen, thank you so much for coming on. It's been lovely to catch up with you, and great to get your views on retail as always, and hope to catch up with you again soon. Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.